When asked why he intended to summit Mount Everest, British adventurer George Mallory's response, "Because it's there," was so immediately iconic and inspiring that it ended up being falsely attributed to Edmund Hillary, who was part of the first confirmed team to reach the peak. The simplicity of "because it's there" evoked man's natural desire to push the limits in the name of exploration and achieve greatness at any cost, which is fitting, as Mallory would disappear climbing the mountain in 1924. But his legacy would ultimately inspire Hillary and Tenzing Norgay to reach the summit in 1953. History enthusiasts can be forgiven for lapses in detail when the myth is so powerfully evocative. The well-documented male fixation with ancient Rome is strikingly similar, albeit with one significant alteration. The reason that men love to think about Rome isn't because it's there, but rather because it's not. Though much of the Roman legacy remains with us, for good and for ill, the disappearance of a state, people, and culture that was so foundational to the modern world poses limitless questions for history, and perhaps just as importantly, nearly limitless answers that we can posit, which will never be directly contradicted. Because Rome collapsed, it's become a giant question mark at the center of Western civilization that immediately prompts one to consider the vagaries of fate and our own places in history. If you're even somewhat contemplative, this will spark introspection, as Rome causes historians to wonder about the eventual fates of their own societies and whether anything that we do in this life will have lasting significance. These are questions that every human must wrestle with, but I think they might have an added valence for men who, at least in my experience, are more emotionally invested in leaving a legacy that resonates hundreds of years later. Maybe this is why men are so apt to identify with Rome's chief historical figures instead of the downtrodden commoners. But more on this male vanity later. With Rome, we know just enough to know how much we don't know. And so everyone gets to have their pet theories on everything from big questions, such as the reason behind the empire's fall, to aspects of daily life, like gladiator bouts. Rome is a mirage, and it invites us to fill in the blanks with theories that often say more about us than the independent reality that was the Roman civilization. The Greek philosopher Xenophanes commented on a similar phenomenon when noting how his contemporaries created gods that were expressions of their own values instead of representations of divine truth.
If cattle, or horses, or lions had hands, or were able to draw with their feet and produce the works which men do, horses would draw the forms of gods like horses, and cattle like cattle, and they would make the gods' bodies the same as their own.
The fact that there is no legitimate successor state to the Roman Empire in modern times also allows Rome to be all things to all men in a way that isn't possible with the empire of, say, Han China or other contemporaneous states. The elasticity of Rome, combined with the incredible accessibility of its history and the clear influence it has had on modern civilization, create an appeal that has proven irresistible to many, myself included. But in addition, Rome is simply fascinating, and the sheer wealth of Roman culture and history from its nearly 1,000 years at the forefront of Mediterranean civilization means that there are plenty of focus areas for a budding historian to dive into, which match their specific interests. From religion and architecture to military history and political development, there's plenty to find, even for the most obscure niche interests. Personally, I'm fascinated by ancient Rome because, for me, it's the first point at which history becomes intelligible. There were interesting societies before Rome and after, but for me it represents a millennium of transition from history that is shaped by gods, myths, and legends, and toward a world that looks increasingly like our own. But you don't need to be a man to find that intriguing. So why, then, is there such a gender imbalance in interest in the Roman world? Well, it's typically because, despite the limitless range of topics that might be studied, the most significant interest area among the general population is Roman military history, which, I imagine, outweighs all the others put together. This, unsurprisingly, skews male. Furthermore, all too often at the mass level, military history can result in uncritical appreciation for the efficient and effective Roman war machine that leaves some to pine nostalgically for a return to the rigid patriarchal social order of ancient Rome. Unsurprisingly, this small but vocal reactionary contingent is even more overwhelmingly male. Even those who reject this vision and want to study Rome from a relatively more enlightened angle must admit that our surviving sources give us only the slimmest of windows into the world of ancient Roman women. They are by and large excluded, which understandably makes it much harder for modern women to look back on Rome as an enlightened society that is worth investigating or emulating. Of course, not everyone approaches history with the goal of finding figures that directly inspire them, but many do, however consciously, and it's only natural to gravitate toward eras that offer figures with whom we can identify to some extent. The relative dearth of Roman women in the history books is a hurdle that women will feel more acutely than men. This should come as little surprise, since we possess documents that were written by elite men about elite men, with very few exceptions. When women such as Agrippina or Livia do manage to rise to unprecedented heights and therefore cross the pages of history, they are relentlessly belittled in their sources, so much so that it's difficult to separate fact from fiction thousands of years later, and we're left with only two distinctly Freudian modes of Roman womanhood: the dutiful, subservient wife and mother, or the wicked harlot. Both of these are really just literary inventions that have little basis in the actual women who made up half of Rome's population. But the fact that nearly all women are compressed into one of these two archetypes stands in stark contrast to narratives about Roman men. Even when presented negatively by our sources, Roman men are characterized with the complexity befitting actual humans. This is the beginning of an explanation, but it's not quite entirely sufficient. So let me volunteer a theory on the unique appeal of Rome to the male mind. Unlike women, men have a greater tendency to look at Rome and identify a world that looks like every aspect of it was made for us. This is only partly true, as while society was designed to improve the lives of men, it was really only some men who benefited from these arrangements. This is not a new phenomenon. After all, Edward Gibbon famously said,
If a man were called to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would, without hesitation, name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus.
The idyllic world referenced here is more subjective than Gibbon lets on. In reality, only the upper echelon of Roman society had anything approaching a decent quality of life, even at the empire's height. But bizarrely, this is who many Roman history buffs consciously identify with whenever they approach the past, forgetting that the portion of society made up by the imperial house, senators, and equestrians was infinitesimal compared to the general population. So here's a hint. If you weren't born to a United States senator, there's no reason to think you would have been born to a Roman one. It's exponentially more likely that a person taken at random off the Roman street would have been a slave, as these accounted for roughly 30% of the population, but never seem to figure in anyone's imagination when they picture themselves as having been born in Roman times. Men are more prone to this daydreaming about ourselves in ancient Rome because for us, there appear to be limitless possibilities. We're always naturally aristocrats, and life as a Roman emperor, general, senator, orator, poet, or architect can seem preferable to some modern-day alternatives. Because options for women were so limited, fewer are likely to have any illusions about what their fate would have been had they been Roman. The reality is we would have all been in the underclass, and women are at least smart enough to understand this and daydream accordingly. The decline and fall of Rome means today that the empire exists in a bizarre liminal state. We know more about it than societies that preceded it, and those that existed alongside it, but still, many questions remain and, unfortunately, we'll never be able to ask an actual Roman. This means that scholarly conjecture can be just educated enough to feel conclusive, making it easier for each of us to construct a purely private mental version of Rome in our image that adheres to the values we prioritize. The best part of this is that, unlike a fixation on, say, Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire, we never need to worry about being contradicted by an actual Roman. In contrast, not only are there plenty of Mongols living today who have a stake in how previous Mongolian states are presented, but Khan himself is ancestor to about 0.5% of the global population. The Mongols are clearly still with us, in ways that the Romans are not. Rome was a vibrant, sprawling civilization that existed for over a millennium. There was no one monolithic Rome, or even a way to be Roman that remained unchanged from Romulus to the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus. Are you an arch-conservative with politics bordering on fascism? Well, then you'll love the rigid social hierarchy and the endless wars of expansion. If you're a reformist liberal, you can take pride in the push by the Gracchi brothers for greater plebeian rights and a more just society. But it goes beyond politics. Every aspect of Roman life is replete with this duality and ability to take wildly divergent positions that are both supported with ample evidence. A professing Christian can celebrate Rome as the society which helped spread the church to the wider world and gave it the structure necessary to evangelize millions, while a staunch non-believer can look back at the earlier polytheism as preferable and possibly even wonder what may have happened had efforts to suppress the church been successful. There's no one right answer here because there was no one Rome. Rome was all of these things. Rome was none of them. Anyone with a predilection for speaking in absolutes about Rome would do well to remember this. Rome is fascinating, so the interesting question isn't why are men thinking about Rome? That's obvious. It's why aren't women as interested? Our theory is that women find it less appealing in part because of the difficulty in identifying with the driving historical figures of an incredibly patriarchal society. This problem will persist as long as the study of Rome remains closely tied to uncritical admiration for Rome. Ironically, the failures and futility of Rome are made all the more apparent by those who praise her the loudest. Ostensibly pro-Rome voices extol the empire's power and longevity, but both of these faded long ago, and drawing attention to how high the empire ascended cannot help but remind us of how far it fell. Roman scholarship has adopted a more critical and less chauvinistic attitude for the past several decades, but sometimes this approach has yet to trickle down to the general public. It's one of our chief goals on this channel to accelerate the more comprehensive perspective on Rome, and we believe that bringing more people into the fold who adopt a critical approach will open up the fascinating world of the ancient Romans to a wider audience. If we can learn lessons from Rome's shortcomings to improve lives today for women and men alike, then the Romans will matter again, and the hundreds of millions of people who lived, suffered, loved, wept, laughed, worshipped, and died under the banner of Rome can still change the world.
Hi, Gaius here. Thanks for being part of our efforts to shed light on the more obscure topics related to the fascinating world of the ancient Romans. If you enjoyed Titus's work here, please do us a favor by liking and subscribing. Gratias vobis ago.